The ability to have that really optimizes your shop floor. It really makes your labor and overhead costs much more efficient because people aren't waiting around for that plasma table to cut that part. So there's a lot of benefits that come with that scheduling. And what that also allows you to do is if you have rush orders, and you're capable to promise, what's that net impact going to be to the schedule if you make a change to, if I take an order out of there, I need to know that if that's going to impact my customer's order, I got to call my customer and let them know that I have a potential issue. So between material requirements planning and scheduling, or master scheduling as it's called, a lot of that smoothing and a lot of that ability to deliver on what you promise really kind of comes to light. So those are two very crucial benefits of using manufacturing software. The third area, which is something that I hear from a lot of people who end up purchasing manufacturing solutions, is that they now can manage their vendors effectively. They manage their contracts. They see if their vendor's the issue. Good example of that is a good manufacturing system will begin to look at every single vendor's purchase orders. So as you receive them in, it will look at the number of lines that you get in other words, purchase order lines you have. If the vendor promised you a certain date and delivered on different dates, what the vendor's actual lead time is versus their promised lead time. And I always like to tell this story. If I have a vendor who I single source that part from, and he's a PIA, and you know what PIA stands for, and he keeps promising me 5 days lead time, but my system's telling me that it's 10 days lead time, I'm going to call him up and tell him I need it in 5 days, 10 days before I really need it, because I know he's lying to me. So it lets me be much more effective in managing my vendor because I can actually see what his real-time performance is versus what his promised performance is. And if I'm cost-conscious on who I buy from, it's going to show me if there's any variances in the quoted prices and the quoted quantities. Because sometimes I also want to see if I order 10 from the vendor and 10% of every single order comes in defective, and I go to order, I need 10 for my shop order the next time, chances are I'm going to probably order 11 of them because historically the vendor gives me 10% of his stuff that I order from him is bad. So now it allows me to not be short, right? Sometimes if you order 10 and you only get 9, you may not be able to produce. Now, a lot of us will order more in anticipation of that, but wouldn't it be better to know that it's really 10% and not 20%? Because if you're going out saying, well, the vendor might give me some bad stuff, so I'm going to order 12. I'd much rather order the 11 and keep that 12th one in the bank with my cash where it belongs. So it's a good thing to be able to manage your vendors and to see if they're the problems, because a lot of times when you're running material requirements planning, you want to see if the reason why you're not making your production orders isn't because of you internally and your ability to meet the manufacturing, but it may be because the availability of raw materials are so that they keep coming in late. And that's an important part of you being able to manage your overall process. So that's a big area to see if the vendors are a problem. And if you use manufacturing software, you should be able to spot those trends. Sometimes if you need something in a pinch, it may force you by looking at that vendor saying, his performance isn't good, I need to go to an alternate vendor. And even though it may cost me more, it's the need more than it's the cost at this point. So there's some good benefits of contract management and vendor management as well. And it also allows you to kind of use the baseball bat on the vendor the next year. When the vendor calls you up and tells you that he wants to raise his prices, you say, well, wait a minute now. Let me think about this. 40% of your orders came in late. 20% of the time it's over cost. 15% of the time I'm rejecting something. And you want to raise your prices to me? Try again. Let's revisit this in another year when you're a little bit more efficient or effective, or perhaps you'd like me to maybe source another vendor. It makes it very, very strong for your negotiating position to have numbers that you can put in front of your vendor and that are real-time numbers of how your relationship with him has worked. Capacity planning, build and deliver. A lot of times we make promises that we can't deliver on because we look at our capacity and we realize that, you know what, we just don't have enough time in the day to be able to do that. So, capacity planning, when you use that in terms of your scheduling, is going to show you what your load is on your work centers, like we mentioned before, and allow you to then smooth that. And that's a good feature to have, because when people don't have a manufacturing system, they just start scheduling orders and they put it up on a chipboard, one of those whiteboards, or they use it in Excel, but they never really think about, how many of those orders are going to hit that one particular cell or work center at the same time, and what's its impact going to be. And if I can't meet those other orders, what does that do to the rest of my operation? So, the ability to say, can I build it and can I deliver it, is an important part of customer satisfaction and another benefit. A big area is lot and serial control and traceability. For people that have any kind of recalls or sell food products or deal with the FDA or the USDA, it's mandatory. And whether you do it in a computer system or manually, it's mandatory. And it's a lot easier to do it when you have a computer system that can look through your entire product structure, because that's what's really important. If I have a raw material and I use it in product A and I use it in product B, and product B then goes into product C, I need to be able to go through the entire product structure to determine if there's a recall on a raw, on an intermediate, or on a finished good, so that I could recall that correctly. And it's very difficult to do that if it's a paper-based system. You have to first find the order, then you have to go to the manufacturing order that corresponds with it, then you have to look at the bill of materials, then you have to look at what you issued to that order for that raw material and determine which lots they were. And that's a big, big problem if you have a recall. And chances are you're going to end up with fines if you can't produce that information in a timely manner. So having lot traceability is a wonderful feature. It allows you to track things through your system. The control can start at any level. Usually it comes in at the point of receiving if it's raw material. Some parts, some items, when they get mixed together, don't get lots assigned to them until they're a finished good. So you might have lots at the finished good level, lots at the raw material level. And you need to be able to have visibility through your entire product structure. The other thing is serialized inventory. Very important for you to be able to monitor and track serial numbers. The difference between lots and serials, serial number is one. I have one unit, it gets a unique serial number. Lots can be multiple. I can have a lot of 5,000 items in that lot, and as long as it's issued from the lot, I can have multiple issues out of a lot. With a serial number, it's one-to-one. Serial numbers allow me to do things like track warranties, allow me to track ownership, right? A lot of times someone calls you up, they sold it on eBay or something, or someone bought it at a flea market, which voids your warranty. So the person calls you up and says, I have a problem with my product, here's the serial number. You look it up and you realize that that was not the original order, so now you begin to ask questions. Well, how did you get this item? We had sold it to X, Y, and Z company, and now you seem to have it. And they say, well, we bought it from them on eBay. Well, I'm sorry, that voids our warranty. Would you like to buy a new warranty? So being able to have visibility to serial and being able to also use serial tracing for purposes of recall as well is a nice feature to have, and manufacturing software, if you turn that on, is a great thing to have. Accurate costing and multiple costing methods. What I like about most manufacturing systems is lots of times they have the flexibility and allow you to track costing multiple ways. First of all, most companies have different methods of costing. There's average costing, which if I buy 5 at $1 and I buy another 5 at $2, my average cost of those 10 is $1.50. Last cost, if I buy 5 at $10 and I buy the next 5 at $5, the last cost is $5. That allows me in purchasing to really kind of spot, what was the last cost I paid for it, because I might want to negotiate off of that. And then most manufacturing people still use the good old-fashioned version called standard costing, which you need to question standard costing, because if you're a make-to-order manufacturing, you don't have standards. And what I see in the field a lot is people using standard costing in a make-to-order environment, and then they become a slave to making adjustments to their standard cost. And when I ask the question, why you use standard costing, the answer I get is, well, we've always done it that way, or that's what the accountant wants. And then when you talk to the accountant says, well, I can use a different costing method, and then at the end of the year I can make the adjustment back for the variances. So, while standard costing is the age-old method, it tends to work better in a repetitive manufacturing environment, and in a good manufacturing software, it will trap and capture those variances that occur. And what we mean by variance accounting is if my standard is $1 and I get it for $1.20, that 20 cents represents a purchase price variance or a cost variance for me. So how do I book that? Well, most people will categorize that in a separate expense account, and then they'll analyze it at the end of the year, at the end of a period of time, and they'll make adjustments to what the standard is. Standard cost usually assumes that prices don't change that often, or that we're only going to change that standard once or twice a year. The most common method that you're finding today, believe it or not, is lot-based costing or actual costing, which looks at the cost of that item, and in most manufacturing, you could actually look through your job costing module and see what it cost you to produce that particular item on that particular production run. And that's a great way to really kind of determine what your true profitability is, right? Because sales minus your cost of goods gives you your gross profit. So we want to have an accurate costing. Even though we're a different costing environment, we want to see what the gross profit is that we have. So multiple costing methods, ways of looking at things. Some systems will let you cost at a location level. Other systems will let you cost at an item level. Some systems require you to generate a single costing method across the entire enterprise. It really depends upon the application. But having that accurate costing and having it relatively real time is very, very powerful for you to really be able to do some detailed analysis during as well as after the fact. Labor performance. This is another area that tends to kind of drop into the abyss that manufacturing software really kind of helps you with. People look at their overhead and they have a rate and how do I get my, if you think about it, typically your cost of materials are pretty competitive in the region that you live in. And your labor cost is probably pretty competitive in the region that you live and work in. So where do people really differentiate themselves from other people is kind of gets into the management of the overhead, right? And labor performance is good for a bunch of reasons. One is if I have a standard established for labor, obviously I want to see how people are related to that standard of labor. But also when they're not performing well, that becomes indirect, which really feeds into my overhead, doesn't it? So now my overhead goes up, which makes me less competitive when I'm quoting the price or quoting the cost. I want that overhead is that if I can get that number low, that's how I beat my competitors. So if I have a good system, I'm going to beat my competitors because they don't. They're using paper. I have a much better handle on my labor performance, direct and indirect, and I see how certain people are doing as well, which allows me to move people around on my shop floor. So if I've got a Class A welder, if I've got a guy who can weld something in 15 minutes, but I've got an apprentice who does something in 40 minutes, I may decide that, I want to move that welder in the main line. I'm going to take the other welder who's not as quick and I'm going to move him to my parts area because he's just going to work on cut parts. Or I may decide that I want to replace him with someone else because I have a standard in here and he's not living up to my standard. And that's an important part of it. So lots of times, you're counting on the production manager to go out on the floor and be able to see who's working right and who's not, but that's a very, kind of subjective thing. This way, numbers don't lie because when people clock in and clock out, you see exactly how long they took to do something, and now you can begin to compare them. Great way of handling incentive pay. You want to pay people for, beating the standard. Having labor performance becomes the tool that you would use to use that. So I have a lot of clients who, to really improve the productivity because they're kind of, lean manufacturing, Kaizen-based, have actual incentive-based performance. And what they do is they'll look at, what their time is, and depending on how quickly something can get done will depend on what their reward is. So think about that. That's a real strong area to have.